I stood there, coffee in hand, as the ground beneath my feet rumbled. It wasn't thunder, it was something worse. I watched as two HOA trucks and a massive drilling rig barreled down my driveway, not slowing down, not even bothering to ask. My stomach dropped as they cut through the cattle gate, heading straight for my land. I rushed out, demanding answers. The young worker barely glanced up. "Water survey, sir. HOA approval. This is private property," I shouted, but it didn't matter. They kept drilling. And when the smell hit the thick sulfuric stench, I knew this wasn't just a mistake. It was something far worse. But they didn't know it yet. I was just getting started. Nancy Tillman wasn't someone who needed to shout to assert control. Her voice was sharp, polished, almost rehearsed, like a bureaucrat who'd perfected the art of deflection. I could almost picture her sitting behind her desk, pearls at her neck, a perfect smile, hiding the iron grip she had on the HOA's operations. The moment I mentioned the drilling on my land, I could feel her tightening her hold. "I'm not sure why you're upset, Mr. McCrae," she said, her voice crackling through the speaker. "This is a community effort. The board approved this unanimously." I let out a bitter laugh. "You're drilling on my property, Nancy. I didn't give you permission for any of this." She didn't blink. "We have the right under emergency environmental access provisions. Your property is on the aquifer map. You should have received an email from us about this." I shook my head, the anger rising. I didn't get any email, and I sure as hell didn't get a knock on my door. A long pause followed, like she was deciding how best to manipulate the situation. "Well, perhaps check your spam folder, Mr. McCrae." Her tone was casual, dismissive, like I was just some cranky old man making a fuss over nothing. I hung up, my blood boiling. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't about the environment. It was about control, and Nancy knew it. The HOA had made their move, and I was the last person they expected to fight back. The next few days were a blur of frustration. The drilling continued, a low, persistent hum in the background, cutting through the peace I'd fought so hard to build. Each morning, I walked to the edge of my property, watching the workers go about their business, as though they owned the place. I'd leave them messages, leave calls with the county office, but it was always the same. "We've got approval from the HOA board." It was as if my land didn't even matter. They weren't asking for permission anymore. They were telling me what they were going to do, like they already owned it. And then came the note. A small, unassuming thing left on my doorstep one morning. "Reminder, HOA environmental survey in progress. Please keep livestock clear of work area." No signatures, no details, just a generic reminder. I called the county office again. This time, they told me the same thing. "The survey is authorized." But there was something in their tone this time, a hint of doubt. They didn't know about the drilling. They didn't know about my land. I felt the walls closing in. Something wasn't right, and I wasn't going to let it slide. The following day, I found the first crack in their facade. My fence, the one that separated my land from theirs, was cut. Not opened, cut. A clean break like a knife through bone. There, lying at the base of the fence, was a pair of bolt cutters, half buried in the trampled grass. I wasn't just dealing with an overzealous HOA anymore. This was trespassing, vandalism, and it wasn't the first time. They'd been inching closer, testing boundaries literally and figuratively. When I walked down to the site, one of the workers was standing near the borehole, scribbling notes on a clipboard. I approached him, my boots crunching on the gravel, my pulse quickening with each step. "Who authorized this?" I demanded. He barely looked up. "It's a county-approved survey," he muttered, brushing me off. I shook my head. "No. You don't understand. This is my land. You've crossed the line. You've cut my fence. You've started drilling without any legal right to be here." He paused, his face flushing slightly. But instead of apologizing, he just shrugged. "Take it up with the HOA. They said it's fine." It was clear now, this wasn't just a mistake. They weren't taking me seriously, and I wasn't going to let them get away with it. The next morning, the smell hit me before I even stepped outside. A sickly, pungent odor like rotten eggs mixed with burned metal. I thought it might be the septic line acting up, but when I opened the door, I saw it. The ground around the borehole was oozing a thick yellowish froth. Steam rose from the hole like something from a nightmare. I grabbed my boots and ran down the gravel path, stomach twisting. When I reached the site, the crew was still working, though now they wore respirators. But it was too late for that. The air was thick with sulfur, and I could already feel it burning the back of my throat. I couldn't ignore it anymore. This wasn't just bad planning. This was reckless. One of the workers saw me and raised his hand in greeting, but his eyes were red. He was coughing, clearly struggling against the fumes. I stepped closer, my anger rising like a tide. "What the hell is going on here?" I demanded, pointing at the bubbling slurry. The foreman, the one who had been so smug when I first confronted him, came over clipboard in hand. He didn't even flinch when I mentioned the sulfur. "This is a routine pressure test," he said, as if it was no big deal. "We'll be done in a few days." "A few days," I spat. "You've poisoned the soil. You've breached something underground. This isn't routine. You don't even know what you're doing." But he only shrugged. "Take it up with the board." I called the sheriff. I called the county office. The HOA had ignored my complaints long enough. I was done being polite. I went into town to file a formal complaint. The sheriff wasn't in, so I left a statement with the deputy detailing what I'd seen. By the time I got back, I knew the HOA would be covering their tracks. So I took it to the next step. I called Jack Perkins, a friend from my days with the Corps of Engineers. He didn't ask many questions, just said, "Text me the coordinates. I'll look at the water rights overlay this afternoon." While Jack was investigating, I stood at the edge of my property watching the drilling. The hum of the rig was louder than it had ever been. It seemed to vibrate through my bones, now deeper, angrier. And when I looked around, I saw the first signs of real damage. The trees along the border were wilting. Something was seriously wrong. The authorities might be on their way, but by then, the damage could already be irreversible. By noon, I had my confirmation. I received a call from Linda at the county office. She had pulled the latest survey records, and there were no easements, no permits, nothing to justify what the HOA was doing. They were flying blind, trying to cover their tracks after the fact. That was the breaking point. I knew what I had to do. I called Jack, who told me he'd have a geotechnical team come out to collect soil samples. But by the time I had the lab results in hand, the neighborhood was already beginning to feel the effects. I walked past my neighbor James's place that evening. His front yard, usually well kept, was showing signs of distress. And the smell, his wife had started complaining of headaches. His kids were feeling sick, and the trees on his property dying. I looked over the fence at the HOA's manicured trees, the ones they boasted about, and noticed they were starting to show signs of distress too. The leaves were curling at the edges. Some had already started to fall. The sulfur had spread, and no one at the HOA was acknowledging the damage they had done. They wanted to brush it all under the rug to keep pretending like everything was fine, but I wasn't going to let that happen. The HOA's board meeting was supposed to be their chance to smooth things over, but it didn't take long for the community to turn on them. The room was packed. Residents who had kept their heads down for months now stood tall, their faces hard with anger and confusion. They'd been told the drilling was harmless, just part of a necessary survey, but the evidence was mounting. I stepped forward with my file, the documents, the video, the water samples. The board, all stiff smiles and cold shoulders, tried to keep the facade up. But I could see the panic in their eyes. Nancy Tillman, in her pristine white blouse, tried to smooth things over, but her hands were trembling. Mark Fisher, the HOA VP, shifted in his chair, glaring at me like I was the problem. "You've poisoned the land," I said, raising my voice just enough to command attention. "You've ruined the water, the trees, the soil, and you think you can lie your way out of it. This isn't just a mistake. This is negligence. This is fraud." The crowd erupted, and for the first time in months, I could feel the power shift. This wasn't about a few trees anymore. This was about truth. I pulled out my phone, my hand steady now, even though my heart was pounding. I clicked play. The footage rolled the drilling rig in action, the sulfur runoff, the workers clearly disregarding the damage, the HOA's contractors cutting through my fence without permission. The room went silent as the images flickered on the screen, each one a hammer blow to the HOA's lies. Then I presented the documents, the emails, the backdated permits, the fake survey records Linda had uncovered. I walked through the lab results, showing the sulfur contamination levels in the water samples. Each fact, each image, each report built a case that the HOA couldn't ignore. "You've destroyed my land, my community's trust," I said, "and you're still trying to cover it up. But it's too late. You can't lie your way out of this anymore." Nancy's face had gone ashen, her usually calm demeanor cracking. Mark Fisher was white-knuckling the armrests, his gaze shifting from the screen to the crowd, desperately trying to hold on to whatever authority he thought he had left. The room wasn't just angry anymore. It was ready for justice. Mark Fisher stood up, his hands trembling as he motioned for the meeting to end, but it was too late. The damage was done. The residents had seen the truth. One by one they stood up, shouting questions, demanding answers. The HOA couldn't deflect it anymore. "Who gave you the right to trespass on private land?" one woman yelled. "Why didn't you notify us?" another asked. "Are you going to fix the trees and the water?" James shouted from the back. The board tried to regain control, but it was impossible. Nancy's voice cracked as she spoke, her words stumbling over each other. "We'll issue a statement. We're working on a solution. But the crowd wasn't listening anymore. The anger, the betrayal, it was all too much. And when James stood up holding a thick folder in his hands, the room went quiet. He didn't hesitate. I motioned to dissolve the current board under Article 9 of the HOA Charter for gross negligence and misconduct. The vote came fast, swift, and overwhelming. 76 to 24. The board was gone. Nancy, Mark, and the rest of them were ousted one after another. The power had shifted, they had been exposed, and there was no coming back from it. As I stood there, the weight of the moment settling over me, I felt a rush of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Victory. Not just for me, but for the land, and for everyone who had been silenced. The morning after the vote, Oak Summit felt different. For the first time in months, I could breathe without that nagging sense of dread, without the constant hum of a drill, or the smell of sulfur in the air. The HOA's stranglehold on the neighborhood had been broken, and with it the silence that had once suffocated the truth. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to before began to approach me, some with apologies, others just with quiet gratitude. James and his wife came by, bringing over a jar of sweet tea, his daughter in tow. She handed me a small potted plant, her innocent eyes full of hope. "You saved our land," he said, his voice steady. "Thank you for not backing down." I smiled, accepting the plant. It wasn't just about my land anymore. It was about all of us standing together to protect what was ours. The community that had once been fractured, divided by the HOA's manipulation, was starting to heal. The trees that had once been poisoned, their leaves curling at the edges, began to show signs of life again. Slowly but surely, new growth started to appear. The air felt cleaner, the soil less tainted. The peace I'd fought so hard for was returning, and this time it wasn't just mine to protect. It was ours. The legal fallout didn't take long to hit. The county moved swiftly, launching a full investigation into the HOA's illegal drilling operation. The Department of Natural Resources came in assessing the long-term damage to the aquifer and groundwater. The fines began to pile up. Nancy Tillman and the rest of the board members had already resigned, and now they were facing criminal charges for environmental negligence, trespassing, and fraud. But it wasn't just about the money or the penalties. It was about accountability. The HOA had built their empire on secrecy and control, using their power to manipulate and suppress. Now, they were paying the price. The community rallied behind the cause, supporting the investigation, sharing their stories, and offering whatever evidence they could. As the case made its way through the courts, the HOA's reputation crumbled. The media picked up on the story, turning Oak Summit from a sleepy suburban neighborhood into a cautionary tale of unchecked power and corruption. The settlement offered by the HOA's new interim board was generous, but it came with strings attached, no gag orders, no NDAs. The truth was out, and it was staying that way. Weeks passed, and things began to settle down. The new interim board took over, though they were still reeling from the mess the old one had left behind. They promised to make changes: more transparency, better communication, and a stronger commitment to the environment. But I knew better than to trust them completely. The damage had been done. Their reputation, much like the soil on my land, had been irrevocably tainted. I kept my focus on what mattered most: my land. Slowly, the healing began. The trees that had once stood lifeless were beginning to bud again, fragile at first but strong in their resilience. The ground that had once been poisoned by sulfur was now being replenished, enriched with native plants that could withstand the challenges of the land. One afternoon, Denise stopped by with her kids, the youngest carrying a small tree. They wanted to plant it on my property, a symbol of new beginnings. We all knelt together as they placed it in the soil, their laughter filling the air. It was a simple act, but it meant everything. I sat down later that evening, the sun dipping low in the sky, the wind soft against my face. The land had started to recover. So had I. The quiet I'd fought for wasn't just silence anymore. It was peace, a peace forged from truth, a peace that couldn't be broken by anyone. Not by the HOA, not by the lies they tried to spread, and not by the poison they'd left behind. As I stood up and walked toward the barn, I looked over the property one last time, the healing land beneath my feet, the trees reaching toward the sky. And I knew that this fight wasn't just mine. It was for every neighbor who had suffered in silence, for every person who had been gaslit into submission, and for every inch of land that had been taken for granted. This wasn't just about winning. It was about making sure no one else had to fight the same battle. The wind whispered through the trees as I took my place on the porch. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over McCrae Ridge. For the first time in a long while, I felt something that I hadn't expected: peace, and it was mine to keep